Imagine you are standing in front of the Lizzie Borden House in Fall River, Massachusetts. This is the place where a father and a stepmother were found brutally murdered. To understand how something like this could happen, we have to go back. Not just back to the morning of August 4th, 1892, when the screaming started and the neighbors came running. Not just back to the weeks of illness and suspicion that preceded it, or to the locked doors and whispered arguments that filled those rooms like smoke. We have to go back much further than that. We have to go back to the kind of life that teaches a woman to be silent, to the kind of house that teaches a woman to disappear, and to the kind of pressure that builds so slowly, so quietly over so many years, that by the time something finally breaks, and no one who was paying attention could honestly say they were surprised. Fall River, Massachusetts, in the latter half of the 19th century, was a city that believed in appearances. It was a mill town that had grown prosperous on the backs of its workers, a city of cotton and machinery and social stratification so rigid that it might as well have been carved into the stone of its own foundations. The people who lived on the hill, the elevated residential neighborhoods that looked down over the smoking factories and crowded tenement streets below, understood their position in the world very clearly. They had earned a particular kind of dignity, or they believed they had, and they protected it with the ferocity of people who suspect that dignity is, at its core, a fragile and easily shattered thing. If you are someone who finds yourself drawn to the secrets that old houses keep, to the stories that never quite made it into textbooks, to the lives of women who were pressed into shapes they were never meant to hold, then you may already feel at home here. This channel, Whispering Estates, exists for exactly that kind of curiosity. If you have not already, consider staying with us and subscribing, because the histories we explore here are slow-burning and layered, and this one in particular will ask something of you. It will ask you to listen carefully and to resist the urge to decide too quickly what you think you know. Now, let us return to Fall River. Andrew Jackson Borden was a man who had made himself. This is important to understand, because self-made men of his era carried that accomplishment the way other men carried religion, as both a source of pride and a source of anxiety, something to be protected and never examined too closely. He had begun with very little, had built a furniture business, moved into undertaking, then into banking and real estate, and by the time his daughters were growing into young women, he was one of the wealthier men in the city. Not the wealthiest, but wealthy enough. Wealthy enough to matter. Wealthy enough that the way he chose to live was a subject of quiet discussion among people who thought themselves his social equals. Because Andrew Borden, despite his money, chose not to live on the hill. He kept his family in a narrow, unremarkable clapboard house on 2nd Street, a house that was uncomfortably close to the business district, so a house without the space or elegance that his financial position could easily have afforded. There was no indoor plumbing in the modern sense for much of the time the family lived there. There was no proper bathroom. The house had no back staircase, which meant that any movement from the upstairs rooms to the kitchen required passing through the central areas of the home in full view of whoever happened to be present. It was, by the standards of the time, and certainly by the standards of what Andrew Borden could afford, a cramped and somewhat gloomy place to spend a life. Why did he live this way? Frugality is the word most often used, and it is not inaccurate. Andrew Borden was legendarily tight with money in ways that went beyond practicality into something that felt, to those around him, almost compulsive. He was said to cut the heads off rotting pears and eat the remainder rather than waste them. He maintained strict control over household expenses in a manner that left his wife and daughters with very little financial independence. He monitored, questioned, and accounted for money in a way that his household would have felt not as careful stewardship, but as a form of control. And perhaps it was. Perhaps Andrew Borden, who had come from nothing and built something, lived in perpetual fear that the something could become nothing again, and so he gripped it with both hands and never let the people around him forget that he was the one doing the gripping. His first wife, Sarah Anthony Morse Borden, died in 1863 when their youngest daughter, Lizzie, was only 2 years old. Their older daughter, Emma, was 13. The loss of their mother at such different stages of development shaped these two sisters in ways that the historical record can only partially illuminate. Emma remembered her mother. Lizzie did not, or at least did not, in any conscious, retrievable way. What a child who loses a mother before the age of memory carries is not grief in any nameable form, but rather a kind of absence, a hollow in the centre of the domestic world that may not even be recognized as hollow until something fills it improperly, or fails to fill it at all. Andrew Borden remarried 2 years later, in 1865. His new wife was Abby Durfee Gray, a woman who was, by all accounts, plain in appearance, quietly pleasant in manner, and entirely unprepared for what her marriage to this man would require of her. She was 37 when she married him, and not young, which in the social mathematics of the time meant she was fortunate to be marrying at all, a calculation that would have done very little to strengthen her position within the household she was entering. She brought no particular wealth. She brought no particular status. She brought herself, and she brought a genuine willingness, by most accounts, to mother these two girls who had lost their own mother. Emma, at 15, was old enough to resist this, and she did. The relationship between Emma Borden and her stepmother Abby never warmed into anything that resembled genuine affection. Emma was polite in the way that people are polite when they have decided that politeness is the most effective form of distance. She called Abby by her first name, as did Lizzie. And this was noted by observers at the time as a pointed refusal of the maternal designation. They would not call her mother. They would not pretend that she was. And in a household where appearances were everything and affection was apparently optional, this distinction was permitted to stand, unchallenged and calcifying, for decades. What was it like to be Abby Borden? To have stepped into a house that did not want you? To have spent years attempting to build some kind of warmth in rooms that remained stubbornly cold? She would have understood, in the practical wisdom of a woman of her era, that she had made her arrangement with Andrew, and that the arrangement did not include the enthusiastic acceptance of his daughters. She would have known how to keep herself small, how to go about her domestic work without demanding acknowledgement, how to eat at a table where 2 of the 4 people present had agreed, through some silent and unspoken compact, to treat her as a managed inconvenience. This is not a particularly unusual story for women of the 19th century. What made it particular to Abby was its duration and its intensity, and the specific emotional temperature of that house on 2nd Street, which seems, from every account that survives, to have been not warmly suppressed, not coldly formal, but something more corrosive than either. Something that felt, day after day, like waiting. Lizzie Borden was born on July 19th, 1860, the second and last surviving child of Andrew and Sarah Borden. She was named Lizzie Andrew Borden, carrying her father's name as her middle name in a way that she seemed, as she grew older, or to find either a source of pride or a point of ambivalence. She grew into a young woman who was, by many accounts, socially engaged in ways that exceeded what her home life would seem to permit. She was active in her church, the Central Congregational Church of Fall River, where she taught Sunday school and organised charitable activities with what appears to have been genuine dedication. She was involved in a women's Christian temperance group. She travelled at least twice to Europe, which was not a small thing for a woman of her time, and speaks to either her own resourcefulness or moments of unusual generosity on her father's part. But she came home. Always, she came home to that house on 2nd Street. And this is perhaps the detail that deserves the most attention, more than any of the later details that the trial would make famous. Lizzie Borden was 31 years old in the summer of 1892. She was unmarried, she was educated, she was socially connected, she was known in the community, and she was living in her father's house under her father's rules, with no financial independence, no clear future, and no apparent means of building one. In the 1890s, an unmarried woman in her 30s had very few options that did not depend entirely on the good graces of a male relative. Lizzie depended on her father, and her father, whatever his private feelings for his daughters, was not a man who believed in loosening his grip. Would you have stayed in that house? Knowing what you know about what it cost to stay, about the years of small humiliations and financial dependency, and the daily management of a relationship with a stepmother you had never fully accepted, and a father you could not afford to displease, would you have found a way out? Or would you have done what Lizzie appeared to do, which was to endure it, to smile at church and organise charitable drives and take your vacations to Europe and come back, always, to that narrow house on 2nd Street, carrying whatever it was you carried in the place where your feelings should have been? The spring and early summer of 1892 were not ordinary months in the Borden household. Something had shifted, or perhaps something had simply become undeniable that had been shifting for years. The central event that seems to have catalysed the final deterioration of whatever peace had been maintained in that house was a property matter. Andrew Borden transferred partial ownership of a piece of rental property on 4th Street to Abby and her sister. The property had belonged to Abby's family originally, had passed to Andrew through the marriage, and Andrew's decision to restore it, or a share of it, to Abby represented, in the daughter's interpretation, an act of favouritism toward their stepmother, a redirection of family assets toward the enemy. This is how it must have felt, though neither Emma nor Lizzie would likely have used a word as raw as enemy. They would have expressed it differently. They would have expressed it as concern for their future security, but as worry about what would happen to their inheritance should their father predecease their stepmother, as a perfectly reasonable inquiry into the proper management of family finances. But underneath all of that reasonable language was something much older and much less polished. It was the anger of two women who had watched their stepmother occupy their dead mother's place for nearly 3 decades and had never forgiven her for it, now given a specific, concrete, financial justification for everything they had always felt. After the property transfer, Emma and Lizzie apparently ceased to eat meals with Andrew and Abby entirely. In a house that small, in a house without a back staircase, where movement through the rooms was unavoidably communal, this was not a small decision. It required constant choreography, constant vigilance, the daily management of physical space to ensure that proximity was not mistaken for willingness. They ate at different times. They moved through the house in patterns designed to minimize contact. They maintained, in the most intimate possible space, the architecture of estrangement. And then, a few weeks before the murders, Emma left to visit friends in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. She had been planning to go, and she went. Whatever she knew or sensed or feared, she went. And Lizzie was left alone in the house with Andrew and Abby. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Emma's departure meant that Lizzie lost the one person in that household whose resentments aligned with her own. the one person who had, for decades, agreed with her interpretation of their stepmother and their circumstances, the one person with whom she could exchange a look over the dinner table, or had once been willing to share a dinner table. That meant we both understand what this is. Without Emma, Lizzie was alone in a way that went beyond the merely physical. She was alone in her narrative. In late July and early August, the household experienced something that added a different kind of urgency to the already fraught atmosphere. Multiple members of the household became ill. Andrew and Abby were severely sick, experiencing nausea and vomiting that lasted for days. Bridget Sullivan, the Irish domestic servant who lived in the house and whom Lizzie called Maggie, a name that was not her name, but was apparently the name of a previous servant, and had simply been transferred to her without much consideration for her own identity. Bridget also became ill, and Lizzie became ill. The exact cause of this illness was never definitively established, though the prosecution would later suggest that it represented an early, failed attempt at poisoning. What the illness did, regardless of its cause, was heighten the anxiety in the house to a degree that everyone present would have felt. Andrew and Abby were sufficiently concerned about the illness that Abby went to a neighbour and doctor, Dr. Seabury Bowen, to report that she believed the family had been deliberately poisoned. This is a remarkable thing to do. To go to your neighbour, who is also the family doctor, and say that you believe someone in your household is trying to poison you, is to have reached a specific and terrible conclusion about the place where you sleep. Whether her fear was directed at a particular person, or whether it was a more diffuse and formless terror, is something she took with her when she died. The day before the murders, Lizzie went to the pharmacy of Eli Bence on Columbia Street and inquired about purchasing prussic acid, which is a form of hydrocyanic acid, a deadly poison. She said she wanted it to clean a sealskin cape. Eli Bence refused to sell it to her without a prescription. This is one of those facts that, once known, cannot be unknowed, that lodges itself at the centre of everything else and refuses to move. She would later deny having made this visit. Eli Bence and 2 other witnesses would testify under oath that she had. The judge at her trial would rule this testimony inadmissible, a decision that, to modern ears, sounds astonishing, but which was consistent with the particular legal and social logic of its time. By the evening of August 3rd, 1892, the Borden house was occupied by Andrew and Abby, by Lizzie, by Bridget Sullivan, and by a house guest who had arrived unexpectedly that day. This guest was John Vinicum Morse, the brother of Andrew's first wife, Sarah, and therefore Lizzie and Emma's maternal uncle. He was a frequent visitor and appears to have been genuinely liked by Andrew, which perhaps complicated Lizzie's relationship with him, given that he represented a connection to her biological mother that her father seemed to value more openly than he valued the feelings of his own daughters. John Morse arrived in the late afternoon, had dinner with the family, and stayed the night. The sleeping arrangements in that house on that night are worth considering. Andrew and Abby slept in the same room, as married couples did. John Morse slept in the guest room. Bridget Sullivan slept in her room on the 3rd floor, and Lizzie slept in her room on the 2nd floor, in a room that was connected to her parents' room by an interior door that was kept locked, bolted on both sides, the kind of lock that speaks to a relationship where trust has been replaced by its architectural substitute. The house was hot. August in Massachusetts in the 1890s, without the relief of any cooling system, would have been genuinely oppressive. The windows would have been open, the air thick, the sounds of the street bleeding through without refreshing the rooms. People slept poorly in heat like that, or they lay awake listening, or they moved through the pre-dawn hours in that strange state between sleep and wakefulness, where the ordinary and the terrible can seem briefly indistinguishable. The morning of August 4th, 1892 began with Bridget Sullivan lighting the kitchen stove to prepare breakfast. The heat from the stove added to the already considerable warmth of the morning. John Morse left the house early, went to visit relatives across town, and would establish an alibi that was so detailed and so specific, so precisely accounting for every movement of his morning, that it would later strike some observers as almost too complete, though nothing in the evidence ever seriously implicated him in what followed. Andrew Borden left the house around 9 in the morning to conduct his regular business rounds in the city. Abby Borden went upstairs to the guest room to make up the bed left by John Morse. This was ordinary housekeeping. This was the kind of work that women like Abby Borden did invisibly, without announcement, folding themselves into the daily maintenance of a household that would notice the work only by its absence. She went upstairs with fresh linens and she began to make the bed. Bridget Sullivan went outside to wash the windows of the house, also ordinary, also unremarkable, also the kind of labour that structures a domestic morning in ways that create a kind of temporal architecture. This task before that one, this room before the next, the day organised by the requirements of the house rather than the preferences of the person serving it. And Lizzie, according to her own account, was in her room, or on the stairs, or in the kitchen. Accounts that shifted in the telling in ways that would become significant, doing nothing in particular, existing in the margins of a morning that was, she would maintain, entirely unremarkable to her until it suddenly, horrifyingly, was not. Abby Borden was found in the guest room upstairs. She had been struck with a hatchet, or something very much like a hatchet, approximately 18 or 19 times, though the precise count would be disputed. She fell forward over the bed she had been making, and then onto the floor between the bed and the exterior wall, in a position that suggested she had either heard something and turned slightly, or had simply fallen where she stood. She had been dead for approximately an hour and a half, perhaps longer, by the time anyone claimed to have discovered her, which means that while the morning was continuing downstairs, while Bridget was washing windows and the kitchen was warming up, and the ordinary machinery of the household was running, Abby Borden was already dead on the floor of the guest room. The house had been carrying that secret in its upper story while life continued below it. Andrew Borden returned home around 10:30 in the morning. He was let in by Bridget Sullivan because the front door was locked with 3 separate locks, which was itself unusual enough for a weekday morning to suggest that the locks had been fastened deliberately after Andrew had left. Bridget Sullivan would later testify that she heard laughter, or something like laughter, from the top of the stairs as she struggled with the locks, a sound that emerged from somewhere above her while she worked at the door. What that sound was, and what it meant, and whether it meant anything at all, is one of those small details that disappears into the larger horror, but leaves its trace in the imagination regardless. Andrew Borden went to the sitting room, which was his habit, and lay down on the settee, a low sofa against the wall, and appears to have gone to sleep, or to have settled into the kind of mid-morning rest that a man of 69 in the August heat might reasonably take. He was killed there, on the settee, struck with the same weapon or a similar weapon approximately 10 or 11 times, blows that were delivered while he was either sleeping or just beginning to rouse, blows that were precise enough in their placement to suggest either considerable prior experience with violence or considerable prior deliberation about it. His face was so badly damaged that the identification of his body was accomplished largely through his clothing and his surroundings rather than through his features. Lizzie Borden called for Bridget Sullivan shortly after, saying, in words that have been repeated so many times, they have taken on the quality of incantation, that her father was dead and that someone had come in and killed him. She said she had been in the barn, or in the loft above the barn, looking for lead to make fishing sinkers, and had come in to find him. She said she did not know where her mother was. She called Abby her mother in this moment, which was noted because she had not called her mother in years. She said she had a feeling when she said, "my mother," that she had gone out, that perhaps someone had sent a note for her to visit a sick person, and that this was where she was. A note that asked Abby to visit a sick friend was never found. The sick friend was never identified. The note, if it ever existed, seems to have dissolved into the same air that was keeping so many other things suspended in that house that morning. The discovery of Abby Borden's body in the upstairs guest room changed everything. What had been, for the brief hour or so following Andrew's death, a terrible but somewhat explicable crime, a robbery gone wrong perhaps, an intruder, some unknown enemy of a successful businessman, became something altogether different. 2 people were dead, 2 people in the same house, killed by the same hand, within the same morning, and nobody had been seen entering or leaving the house. The barn yielded no signs of recent presence. The windows had been watched all morning by Bridget Sullivan working outside and by neighbours going about their days. The possibility of an intruder, which the mind reaches for in these moments because it is so much more bearable than the alternative, was becoming structurally unsustainable. What must it have been like to be Bridget Sullivan in those hours? She was an Irish immigrant working in a household whose social position was higher than her own, whose family politics were entirely opaque to her, who had her own illness from those difficult days prior, and who was now the closest witness to something for which there was no framework in her experience. She would be questioned, intensively, and her testimony would be consistent in ways that neither fully exonerated Lizzie nor directly implicated her, which was perhaps the most truthful thing it could be, because Bridget Sullivan seems to have been a woman who told what she knew and withheld what she suspected, which is a very human response to an impossible situation. The neighbours arrived quickly. The police arrived. Dr. Bowen arrived. The house on 2nd Street, which had spent so many years maintaining its sealed, inward, carefully managed privacy, was suddenly full of people. There is something almost violent in this transition, in the way that catastrophe opens private spaces to public scrutiny, the way that doors that have been kept closed are pushed wide, and rooms that have held their secrets for decades are suddenly being examined by people with measuring tapes and notebooks. The house had contained these people, and their resentments, and their grief, and their arrangements for years, and now it could not contain anything. Lizzie Borden, in the immediate aftermath, was described by those present as composed. Not cold, not unmoved, but composed in a way that was difficult to interpret. She was given to her neighbour, Mrs. Adelaide Churchill, who sat with her and offered comfort. She was given medication, reportedly laudanum, by Dr. Bowen, which would later become significant because it potentially affected the reliability of what she said during the initial hours of investigation. She answered questions in the fragmented, sometimes contradictory ways of someone who is either deeply in shock or deeply in calculation. And the terrible thing about those 2 states from the outside is how much they can resemble each other. She said she had been in the barn. She said she had been upstairs. She said she had been eating a pear in the barn. She said she had not gone to the upper loft of the barn. She said she had gone to the upper loft of the barn. These small inconsistencies accumulated like sediment. The inquest that followed was conducted with Lizzie testifying without a lawyer present, under what appear to have been significantly coercive conditions, while simultaneously under the influence of whatever medication had been administered to her. Her inquest testimony, which was subsequently ruled inadmissible at trial on constitutional grounds, and it contained contradictions and strange passages that have been analysed for over a century without resolution. She described her movements in ways that did not align. She expressed uncertainty about things she should have known. She answered some questions with a directness that felt rehearsed, and others with a vagueness that felt genuine. Or the reverse, and the impossibility of knowing which was which is one of the most persistently uncomfortable things about this case. Emma Borden returned from Fairhaven as soon as she received word. The sisters, reunited in catastrophe, presented a united front to the world from that point forward, with a consistency that may reflect genuine mutual support, or may reflect the same decades-long practice of managing an exterior that had served them throughout their lives in that house. They hired Andrew Jennings, a prominent Fall River attorney who had been a long-time acquaintance of their father's, to represent Lizzie. The choice of a lawyer who had known their father was either a gesture of continuity and trust, reaching for the familiar in chaos, or a very careful calculation about the kinds of associations that would be useful in navigating what was coming. Possibly both. Lizzie Borden was arrested on August 11th, 1892, 1 week after the murders. The arrest came after a preliminary hearing at which the evidence was reviewed and found sufficient to proceed. There was a physical hatchet found in the basement of the Borden home, a hatchet whose handle had been recently broken, whose head had been cleaned with ashes in a way that could represent normal household storage, or could represent the removal of evidence. There was the fact of Lizzie's movements on the morning of the murders, the inconsistencies in her account of where she had been, the impossibility of the barn story given the heat and the absence of disturbed dust in the loft. There was the pharmacy visit the day before. There was the dress. The dress is its own chapter. Several days after the murders, a Sunday morning, Lizzie Borden was observed by 3 witnesses, including Emma herself, burning a dress in the kitchen stove. She said the dress was stained with brown paint and was ruined, and she was destroying it. This burning happened while police investigation was ongoing, while the house was still under observation, and while every action taken by the people inside it was being scrutinized. Emma, when asked about it years later under oath, confirmed that the dress had been burned, that she had been present, that she had perhaps encouraged it, that the dress was old and soiled with paint. The timing was, at minimum, spectacularly poor. At maximum, it was the destruction of evidence. The trial of Lizzie Borden began on June 5th, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It lasted 13 days and became, almost immediately, something that exceeded the category of trial and entered the category of event. The national press descended. The courtroom was packed daily. Lizzie Borden sat through the proceedings in dark morning dress with a fan, in composing herself with the same controlled stillness that had characterized her behavior from the beginning, that quality that people interpreted as either innocence or calculation depending on what they had already decided about her. The prosecution's case was, by modern standards, largely circumstantial. They had no witness to either murder. They had no murder weapon definitively tied to Lizzie. They had the inconsistencies in her story, the poison inquiry, the burned dress, the impossibility of an unknown intruder, and the motive of financial fear and long accumulated resentment. They had the proximity, the opportunity, the history. What they did not have was someone who had seen her do it. The defense argued that it was literally impossible for Lizzie Borden, a respectable, religious, church-going woman of good standing, and to have committed an act of this brutality. This argument seems, from a distance of more than a century, more like a social argument than a legal one, more like an appeal to what a certain kind of woman was assumed to be capable of than an argument about facts. And yet it worked. The defense also argued that the prosecution's circumstantial case was riddled with alternative explanations, that the barn story was possible, that an intruder could have slipped in and out undetected, that the hatchet evidence was inconclusive, and that the inquest testimony, the most directly incriminating material, had been correctly excluded. The jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour and returned a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom, when the verdict was read, reportedly erupted in celebration. People cheered, they applauded. There were those who wept with relief. Lizzie Borden herself, who had maintained composure throughout the trial, with the exception of one moment of weeping during the medical testimony describing her father's injuries, appeared briefly overcome, briefly human, before reassembling herself. She walked out of that courtroom a free woman. And here is where the story takes a turn that the history books often rush past in their haste to declare the mystery solved or unsolved. Because what happened to Lizzie Borden after the acquittal is its own kind of haunting. She did not leave Fall River. She stayed. She and Emma purchased a large, comfortable house on the hill, in the fashionable residential neighborhood that their father had always been wealthy enough to inhabit and had always refused to. She named the house Maplecroft. She began calling herself Lizbeth, a small but pointed revision of the name that had been used throughout her trial and throughout her life up to that point. She began living, for the first time, in the manner to which her father's wealth could have entitled her years ago, entertaining, attending the theatre, moving in social circles that were, at least initially, willing to receive her. Fall River society was not, ultimately, so willing. The acquittal had not removed the suspicion, had only removed the legal consequence of it. And the two things are very different. People who believe you murdered your parents will occasionally throw a party for you and eat your food and drink your wine and smile at you across a room while continuing to believe, in the bedrock of their private judgment, that you murdered your parents. Lizzie Borden would have known this. She was not an unsophisticated woman. She would have felt the architecture of social exclusion being built around her even as she hosted dinners and attended theatre performances, would have understood that her acquittal had purchased her freedom, but had not purchased her restoration. The relationship between Lizzie and Emma continued for more than a decade after the trial, the two women living together at Maplecroft, the alliance that had formed in childhood and survived catastrophe holding, in the way that alliances formed under pressure sometimes do, through inertia and shared interest, if not through warmth. And then, in 1905, something happened between them. The exact cause is not fully documented, but the precipitating event appears to have been Lizzie's friendship with a young actress named Nance O'Neill, with whom she had become deeply, intensely attached, attending performances, hosting elaborate gatherings in the actress's honour at Maplecroft, spending money and time and attention in ways that Emma apparently found troubling or humiliating, or simply incomprehensible. Emma moved out of Maplecroft in 1905. The sisters, who had spent their entire lives in proximity, who had weathered the death of their parents and the murder investigation and the trial and the acquittal and the social aftermath together, parted. Emma moved to a series of boarding houses and eventually left Massachusetts entirely, settling in New Hampshire, where she lived quietly, gave almost no interviews, and said very little about her sister for the rest of her life. She died on June 1st, 1927. Lizzie Borden died 9 days later, on June 10th, 1927. The two women who had spent their whole lives together, who had kept each other's company through the most extraordinary and terrible events, died within 9 days of each other, in different places, having not spoken, as far as anyone knows, for more than 2 decades. There is something in that coincidence of timing that feels almost too neat, too literary, as if even in death they could not be entirely separated from each other, as if the bond formed in childhood in that house on 2nd Street was more durable than the estrangement that followed. Lizzie left the bulk of her estate to the Animal Rescue League of Fall River, an organisation devoted to the care of animals. She left specific bequests to Bridget Sullivan, her longtime servant, who had by that time returned to Ireland. She left nothing to Emma, who was still alive when the will was drafted, which tells you something, though what exactly it tells you is difficult to say with confidence. Now let us sit with what we know, and what we do not know, and what we may never know. The official verdict was not guilty. No one was ever convicted of the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. The case remains technically unsolved, one of those open wounds in the historical record that every generation returns to and re-examines and reaches new conclusions about, and then returns to again, because it refuses the closure that solved cases eventually achieve. Something about the Borden case resists resolution in a way that feels almost deliberate, as if the questions it raises are more important than any answer could be. Who killed Andrew and Abby Borden? The question is simple, the answers are not. There are those who have argued, exhaustively and with considerable supporting evidence, that Lizzie Borden did it, that the circumstantial case against her, taken in its totality, is overwhelming, that the absence of any viable alternative suspect, the impossibility of the intruder theory, the inconsistencies in her account, the poison inquiry, the burned dress, the motive, and the means together constitute something very close to certainty, even without a confession or a witness. There are those who have argued, equally exhaustively, that the case against her was built on prejudice and assumption, that the prosecution's star witnesses were unreliable, that the physical evidence was mishandled, that a different kind of person in a different social position would never have been arrested at all. There are those who have suggested other suspects, John Morse, a mysterious Portuguese farmhand, a nameless visitor, an unknown enemy of Andrew's business dealings, each theory requiring the dismissal of so much of the known evidence that it can only be sustained by a willingness to believe that the known evidence is somehow misleading about something very fundamental. And then there is the question that lives beneath all of these questions. The question of what it means to try to understand this case from the outside, as we are doing, from the position of people who were not there, who cannot walk through those rooms or sit at that table or feel the specific weight of the air in that house on 2nd Street in the summer of 1892. We are working with records and testimonies and newspaper accounts and legal transcripts, all of which were produced by people with their own agendas and assumptions, filtered through the particular anxieties of their era, shaped by what that era thought it was acceptable to say about women, about class, about money, about families, and what families are allowed to do to each other behind closed doors. The 19th century had very particular ideas about what women were. Women of Lizzie Borden's class and social position were understood to be fundamentally gentle. They were understood to be governed by sentiment rather than calculation, by feeling rather than strategy, by the domestic virtues of patience and endurance rather than by anything that looked like agency in the more forceful sense. This understanding was not accurate, was never accurate, but it was enormously powerful as a social force, powerful enough to organize courtrooms and shape verdicts and determine what counted as plausible and what counted as simply unthinkable. The defense lawyer's argument that a woman of Lizzie's standing could not have committed this crime was not a legal argument. It was an appeal to a social consensus that most of the people in that courtroom shared, and that the jury, 12 men of their era, found compelling. What did women of Lizzie Borden's time and class do with anger? Or what did they do with frustration, with resentment, with the accumulated weight of years spent in circumstances they had not chosen and could not change? They did what the era required them to do. They managed it. They sublimated it into charity work and church activities and the maintenance of appearances. They turned it inward or sideways, or into the management of small domestic rivalries that stood in for the larger conflicts they could not name. They smiled. They endured. They performed the serenity that was expected of them with whatever skill and energy they had available, and they pressed the remainder down into places they may not have fully acknowledged to themselves. This is not to say that Lizzie Borden killed her father and stepmother. It is to say that if she did, the decision did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a specific life in a specific house, with a specific set of pressures, and a specific set of constraints, and a specific accumulation of things unsaid and unacknowledged over a very long time. It emerged, if it emerged at all, from a world that had given her very few options and then watched her use one of them. There is another way to hold this story, and it is equally uncomfortable. What if Lizzie Borden was innocent? What if a 31-year-old woman, already navigating a household that was hostile in every quiet and daily way that households can be hostile, lost her father and her stepmother to violence and then found herself immediately, relentlessly, and publicly suspected of killing them? What if the inconsistencies in her account were the inconsistencies of genuine shock and grief, the way that trauma scrambles narrative rather than the way that calculation produces it? What if her composure was not the composure of guilt, but the composure of a woman who had spent her entire life learning to manage her emotions in public, whose entire social training had been directed toward exactly this kind of self-presentation? What if the most incriminating facts about her, the pharmacy visit, the burned dress, even the locked room and the barn and the timing, all have explanations that are mundane and insufficient and can never be fully proven because the world that would have provided that proof was a world that had already decided? That is its own kind of suffering. To be innocent and believed guilty is a particular horror. To walk free and know that the town you walk free in still believes you did it, that the social circles you move in have admitted you back with the specific tolerance of people who find your presence interesting rather than people who have found your presence genuine. To know that your name will be rhymed and chanted by children in generations to come, that your life will become a byword for a specific kind of female violence, that you will be performed in plays and depicted in ballets and turned into a Halloween costume and analysed in true crime podcasts for more than a century. To know all of this and to still have to get up every morning and live in that body and in that town and in that name. What must it have been like to be Lizzie Borden? Not Lizzie Borden the figure, the riddle, the cultural artifact, but Lizzie Andrew Borden, the specific woman who grew up in that house with those parents and that stepmother and that specific quality of unlove that permeates households where the people in them are performing family rather than being it. The woman who taught Sunday school and organised charitable drives and went to Europe twice and came home to a house where she called her stepmother by her first name across the dinner table for 30 years. The woman who slept in a room with a locked door between herself and the master bedroom. The woman who inquired about prussic acid, or who did not. The woman who burned a dress, or who burned a ruined dress. The woman who was found not guilty and went home and named her new house Maplecroft and began calling herself Lisbeth and never, as far as anyone could establish, ever spoke publicly about what she knew or did not know about the deaths of her father and stepmother. She never confessed. She never gave a detailed public account of her movements on the morning of August 4th. She gave a few interviews over the years that were notable for what they did not say. She maintained, for the remainder of her life, which stretched another 34 years beyond the trial, a privacy about the central event of her existence that could be read as the dignity of an innocent woman who had been unjustly accused and had no interest in continuing to audition for public sympathy, or as the silence of someone who understood that silence was the only thing that had ever truly protected her. The house still stands. The house at 92 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts still stands. It still occupies its corner, still presents its narrow, unremarkable clapboard face to the street. It has been for some years now a bed and breakfast. You can stay there. You can sleep in the rooms where these people slept, eat in the kitchen where Bridget Sullivan made the morning meals, walk up the stairs that Abby Borden walked up on the morning of her death. People do this. People choose this. They choose to spend the night in a house where 2 people were killed with tremendous violence on a hot August morning. And they pay for the privilege, and they seem to enjoy it, or to enjoy the particular thrill of proximity to something that has become almost mythological. What do you look for when you walk through that house? What do you think you might find that the investigators and the journalists and the lawyers and the historians have not found in the 130+ years since that morning? What are you hoping to feel, or to know, or to understand? Perhaps that is the wrong way to think about it. Perhaps the point of standing in that house, or of hearing this story, is not to find the answer, but to feel the weight of the question. To understand, in some visceral way, what it costs to live in a house where the ordinary and the terrible have become indistinguishable from each other. To feel, even briefly, the atmosphere of a household where people are going through the motions of daily life with something enormous and unacknowledged pressing against the walls from the inside. We have all perhaps known a house like that. Not a house with bodies in it, but a house with silences in it. A house where certain topics never arise, where certain doors stay metaphorically closed, where the people who live together have learned to navigate around each other's truths with the efficiency of people who have been doing it for so long that they no longer notice the navigation. We have all known the particular exhaustion of maintaining surfaces, of performing the family at the dinner table, while the family itself has become something that exists primarily in the performance. And we have all, perhaps, had moments in which the question of what happens when the performance finally stops has occurred to us, briefly, darkly, and then been set aside. What Lizzie Borden's story, whatever its true shape, forces us to consider is what happens when those moments are not set aside. What accumulates over years and decades in people who have no sanctioned outlet for the things that are accumulating. What people are capable of, inside their own homes, in the privacy of relationships that the outside world sees only in their carefully managed presentation. What the house knows that the street does not. The rhyme that children would begin singing in the years following the trial has a kind of brutal simplicity to it that belies the complexity of what it is describing. It turns a life of profound psychological complexity, of repression and pressure and ambiguity and loss, into something that can be recited in a schoolyard. It collapses all of that nuance into the most sensational possible summary. The violent act stripped of its context, the woman stripped of her interiority, the house stripped of its years. It is efficient in the way that all caricature is efficient, and it is impoverishing in the way that all caricature is impoverishing. Because the truth about what happened in that house, whatever it was not simple. It was not simple even if Lizzie did it. It was not simple even if she was innocent. It was not simple because the house itself was not simple, was a place of extraordinary emotional complexity, where two women who had lost their mother were raised by a man of enormous emotional withholding in proximity to a stepmother they refused to accept, in conditions of financial dependency and social constraint that left them no clean way out of any of it for decades. The violence when it came, and whether it came from inside the house or from a direction that history has not been able to establish, landed on that specific soil, in that specific atmosphere, after that specific lifetime of preparation. It did not come from nowhere. Nothing does. And here is what I keep returning to when I think about Lizzie Borden, when I think about the 31 years before that August morning, when I think about what it means to spend your adult life in your father's house, under your father's rules, with no financial independence and no clear future, watching your family's assets being redirected toward a stepmother you have spent your whole life refusing to accept. When I think about what that kind of powerlessness feels like, what it does to a person over time, what it builds in the places where it cannot be expressed, I think about the women in her church group who saw her every week and thought they knew her. I think about the people she passed in the street on her daily walks and who smiled at her and received a smile in return. I think about the version of Lizzie Borden that existed in public, that organised the charitable activities and taught the Sunday school and travelled to Europe and came home and sat at the dinner table and managed the temperature of her face in ways that told the world she was fine, that everything was fine, that the household on 2nd Street was the household it presented itself to be. She was a woman of her time, in the sense that her time required her to be unknowable. Not that she chose it, but that the era shaped her toward it, the way water shapes stone, slowly and without announcement. She had been trained from birth to present a surface, to maintain the appearances that her class and her father and her era required of her, to locate her feelings somewhere that was not visible and to leave them there. She had been trained to perform, and she was very good at the performance, and the performance never cracked publicly except, perhaps, on the witness stand, and perhaps in the jury's chamber, and perhaps in the one moment in the courtroom when the medical testimony became too much and the composed surface gave way briefly to tears. What does it mean to not know? To genuinely, after all this time, not know whether the woman we have been talking about for these past hours was a murderer or a victim of circumstance, or something that does not fit neatly into either category. Because that third option is where most of the truth tends to live. Not innocent, not guilty, but human. Not a monster, not a martyr, but a person formed by specific conditions and navigating specific constraints and making specific choices, some of which may have been terrible, and some of which may have been the most reasonable available options in an impossible situation. The house on 2nd Street kept its secrets. Lizzie Borden kept hers. And what we are left with, more than a century later, is not a solution, but a portrait. A portrait of a household, of a family, of a time, of a set of pressures that had very specific effects on very specific people, and of the particular American tragedy of a life lived in the wrong house for the wrong reasons for too long. Fall River has not forgotten. It maintains the house. It maintains the history. It maintains the uncertainty with the particular civic pride of a city that knows its most famous story is also its most embarrassing one. People come from all over the world to stand in front of that narrow clapboard house and take photographs and feel, for a moment, the weight of what happened there. And what they are feeling, I think, is not primarily the horror of the violence, though that is present. What they are feeling is the atmosphere, the specific, accumulated, unmistakable atmosphere of a house where people lived in close proximity for a very long time without ever really knowing each other, or perhaps without ever being permitted to. Imagine standing in the guest room where Abby Borden was found. The room is small. The window lets in enough light to see by. The floorboards have been walked on by so many visitors over so many years that whatever trace they once held has been absorbed and redistributed into the general grain of the wood. There is nothing overtly frightening about the room. There is nothing that announces its history. And yet, the people who stand in it, the visitors who have chosen to be there, who have paid for the experience and arranged their schedules around it, very often describe feeling something that they struggle to articulate. Something in the air of the room, something in the quality of the light or the particular silence that makes them want to leave and then makes them hesitate to leave, that holds them in the doorway for a moment longer than they expected. That hesitation, that is the feeling this story is really about. The feeling of standing at the threshold of something you cannot fully see or name, of sensing the presence of something that has not fully resolved itself, of knowing that you are in a place where something important happened and not being entirely sure what it was or what it means. Lizzie Borden lived with that feeling for 34 years after the trial. She got up every morning in Maplecroft and she ate her breakfast and she managed her household and she wrote her checks to the Animal Rescue League and she attended the theatre and she named herself Lizbeth and she moved through her days with whatever internal weather accompanied her, which we will never know with any precision because she did not tell anyone, or if she did, they did not tell us. There is one account, possibly apocryphal, of a moment toward the end of her life when someone who knew her asked her directly about the murders, and she said, in words that may or may not be accurately reported, that she cannot explain it, and that she has tried, and that she cannot. This may mean nothing. It may mean everything. It may be the closest thing to an admission that the historical record contains. Or it may be the words of an innocent woman expressing the ordinary bewilderment of someone who has spent decades trying to understand how the worst thing that ever happened to her happened in the place she should have been safest, cannot explain it, has tried, cannot. The house is still there, the rooms are still there, and somewhere in the gap between what we know and what we do not know, between what can be proved and what can only be suspected, between the verdict of not guilty and the verdict of history, which has never quite reached a consensus, is the real story. The story that happened behind those walls, in those rooms, between those people, over those years. The story that Lizzie Borden carried inside herself until the 10th of June, 1927, when she died, and took it with her. We are left with the house. We are left with the records and the testimonies and the newspaper accounts and the rhyme and the photographs and the hatchet and the burned dress and the locked door and the missing note and the unidentified sick friend and the prussic acid that was never sold and the fishing sinkers that were never made and the barn loft that was either entered or not entered on a hot August morning while a woman lay dead upstairs and a man lay sleeping downstairs, and a servant washed windows outside, and a city went about its business in the ordinary way of cities that do not yet know what is happening inside one of their houses. We are left with questions. What would you have noticed if you had been there? If you had been a neighbour on 2nd Street that morning, watching Bridget Sullivan work at the windows, hearing the sounds of an ordinary household beginning its ordinary day, would you have sensed anything? Would you have registered the particular quality of that morning's silence, the something off that might have been present but might equally have been nothing at all? Would you have trusted her? If you had known Lizzie Borden in the years before August 4th, 1892, If you had sat beside her in church and watched her with the Sunday school children and spoken to her at charitable events, would you have trusted her? Or would you have sensed, in some dim and uncomfortable way, the pressure behind the surface, the accumulation behind the composure, the woman inside the performance? And here is the question that I think this story ultimately comes down to. Not who killed Andrew and Abby Borden, though that question is real and persistent and may never be answered, but this one. What do we do with the lives of people who lived under conditions of sustained, quiet, socially sanctioned suffering? What do we owe them in our understanding, even when their suffering may have turned outward in directions we cannot condone? What does it mean to hold both things at once, the possibility of terrible action and the context that shaped the person who may have taken it, without collapsing into either easy condemnation or easy sympathy? That is the question the Borden House asks, if you stand in front of it long enough. If you let the narrow clapboard facade and the September light and the particular silence of the place do their work on you. It is not a comfortable question. It does not resolve into anything clean or settled. It sits with you the way certain rooms sit with you, the way certain stories sit with you, in the part of the mind where things that cannot be fully understood are stored alongside the recognition that the understanding is precisely the point, not as a destination, but as a practice, a willingness to keep approaching what refuses to be solved. The house still stands on 2nd Street. The light still falls through the windows at the same angle it fell on that August morning. The rooms still hold their particular dimensions, their particular ratios of space and shadow, the geometry of a domestic world that contained something extraordinary and gave very little away. And somewhere in the history of that household, in the years before the morning everything changed, there was a life being lived. A life of Sunday school teaching and charitable drives and European trips and family dinners and locked doors and brown dresses and pears with their rotten heads cut off and financial arrangements that felt like messages and property transfers that felt like betrayals, and 30 years of calling your stepmother by her first name and meaning something by it that could not quite be named. That life deserves to be held with the full weight of its complexity, not simplified into a rhyme, not reduced to a verdict, not turned into a tourist attraction, though the house has become one, unavoidably, in the way that places where the extraordinary occurred always become places where people go to feel close to the extraordinary, not settled into any narrative that flatters our desire for resolution, held instead as what it was, a life. Specific and irreducible and formed by conditions that shaped it in directions that may have led to terrible things, or that may have ended in terrible things visited upon it from outside. We do not know. After all this time, after all these examinations, after all these retellings, we do not know. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about the house on 2nd Street and the family that lived there, and the morning in August that changed everything. We do not know. We have stood at the threshold and looked in and felt the weight of the atmosphere and asked our questions and listened carefully to every account that survives, and we do not know. The not knowing is the story. The not knowing has been the story for more than a century and will continue to be. Because some houses keep their secrets the way some people keep theirs, with a composure that never fully breaks, that holds through everything that is brought against it, that persists long after the people involved have died and the mourning in question has receded into history. And all that remains is the house and the questions and the particular quality of light through old windows and the sound of the street outside going about its ordinary business, in the ordinary way of streets that have no idea what happened inside one of their houses. Whispering estates will be here when you are ready to enter another house, to stand at another threshold, to feel the weight of another history that does not resolve cleanly into anything comfortable or certain. These are the stories worth spending time with, not because they give us answers, but because they ask us better questions, because they ask us to look carefully at the ordinary surfaces of lives and households and to consider what might be pressing against them from the inside, what accumulates in the silence, what lives in the locked rooms, and what it costs, in the end, to keep the doors closed for so long. The house is still there. It is waiting, as houses do, patient and indifferent, and full of everything it has absorbed and will never give back. Go and stand in front of it if you ever find yourself in Fall River, Massachusetts. Stand on the pavement in front of that narrow clapboard facade and let the house look back at you and feel, if you can, what it is like to face something that knows more than it is telling. Then come back here. There are other houses. There are always other houses.